At dawn on the 30th of April, 1863, 17,000 Union soldiers began stepping onto the Mississippi shore at Bruinsburg. No Confederate regiment waited at the landing. No battery fired into the transports. The first men ashore, soldiers of the 24th and 46th Indiana, walked onto Mississippi soil without hearing a single hostile shot. Behind them, the river was crowded with gunboats, steam transports, barges, horses, artillery, and men packed shoulder to shoulder. A band aboard the ironclad USS Pemberton struck up the red, white, and blue as the invasion began. It was a strange soundtrack for one of the most dangerous moments of Ulysses S. Grant's career. About a mile of low floodplain separated the landing from the bluffs to the east. Until Union infantry occupied those heights, Grant did not have a bridgehead. He had thousands of men trapped between high ground and the Mississippi. If Confederate troops reached the bluffs first, the crossing could become a massacre with the river at Grant's back. But no gray line appeared. The Hoosiers moved inland. More regiments followed. By late afternoon, roughly 17,000 men were ashore, and Union troops held the heights. Only then did the crossing become something more than a gamble. What made the silence at Bruinsburg extraordinary was that Grant had learned only the previous evening that a usable road climbed from this plantation landing to high ground. The Confederates had not fortified the site because it had not been the obvious crossing point. It had not even been Grant's intended crossing point until his first plan failed. Nothing about the army was invisible. Its transports churned the Mississippi. Its gunboats had fought beneath Confederate batteries. Its infantry had spent weeks building roads through flooded plantations. Its cavalry was tearing through the interior of Mississippi. John C. Pemberton had troops, telegraph stations, cavalry, local informants, fortified river positions, and repeated warnings that Grant was moving south. Yet, when the invasion began, Bruinsburg was almost empty. That was the mystery at the center of the Vicksburg campaign. Grant had surrounded his movement with so many failed expeditions, river flotillas, cavalry raids, demonstrations, and genuine threats that Confederate headquarters could no longer tell which danger mattered most. Pemberton saw motion everywhere. What he could not see was decision. Grant did not make his army invisible. He made every other threat look equally real. And while Pemberton watched the ghosts, the real invasion crossed the river. To understand why Bruinsburg mattered, rewind 4 months and look at the river from the Confederate bluffs. Vicksburg stood where high ground pressed against a hard bend in the Mississippi. From those heights, Confederate gunners could watch vessels approach, turn broadside in the current, and remain exposed while the river carried them beneath the city. On land, 9 major forts linked by rifle pits formed a defensive line roughly 9 miles long. Along the river, 13 batteries mounted 37 heavy guns, supported by 13 lighter field pieces against amphibious landings. This was not simply a town with cannon. It was the locking point of a much larger system. By the winter of 1862, Confederate batteries at Vicksburg and Port Hudson controlled about 244 winding miles of the Mississippi. That stretch included the mouths of the Big Black and Red Rivers, arteries linking farms, cattle, men, and supplies west of the river, with armies fighting to the east. So long as those 2 strongpoints remained in Confederate hands, the Union could control the Mississippi above and below them without controlling the river as a whole. President Jefferson Davis called Vicksburg the nailhead, holding the Confederacy's 2 halves together. Grant had already learned what happened when an army approached that nailhead from the obvious direction. In December 1862, William Tecumseh Sherman landed north of the city near Chickasaw Bayou. Between his troops and the bluffs lay flooded ground, tangled waterways, levees, and narrow approaches. Pemberton rushed reinforcements into position. By the time Sherman attacked, approximately 15,000 Confederate troops were waiting on the high ground. Union soldiers crossed open, broken terrain under artillery and rifle fire. Units became separated in the swamps. Men struggled over banks and ditches, while Confederate defenders fired downward from prepared positions. Sherman lost nearly 2,000 men and withdrew. The lesson seemed brutal and simple. Vicksburg could not be taken from the north, but the map offered no clean alternative. West of the river stretched the flooded Louisiana bottomlands. North of the city lay the Yazoo River, bayous, swamps, and Confederate batteries at Snyder's Bluff. South of Vicksburg stood Grand Gulf on another set of heights. Any vessel passing the city had to run beneath its guns. Any army landing below it still had to find dry roads back toward the east. Grant needed to put infantry on the eastern bank, behind Vicksburg's defenses, yet the river itself separated his army from the ground it needed. A crossing without high ground would leave thousands trapped on a floodplain. A landing without gunboats could be destroyed before the troops formed. A route without roads could strand artillery, wagons, and ammunition in the mud. The problem was not merely crossing the Mississippi. The problem was surviving on the wrong bank long enough to become an army again. John C. Pemberton understood the importance of the position. Born in Pennsylvania but serving the Confederacy, he had been ordered to retain Vicksburg and Port Hudson. He strengthened the defenses and stockpiled enough supplies, at least on paper, to support 17,500 men for 5 months. That mission shaped every decision he made. Pemberton was not free to chase every Union movement into the countryside. If he stripped the city to stop one threat, another column or fleet might strike the defenses he had been ordered to hold. The fortress gave him strength, but it also fixed his attention to one place. Grant faced the opposite pressure. Newspapers were already describing his repeated efforts as failures. Washington was watching. Every delay consumed time, credibility, and men. So he began searching for a route around the fortress. He would try canals. He would try rivers that barely deserved the name. He would send ironclads between trees and infantry through water. Vicksburg was a locked door whose hinges were protected by an entire river. Grant's next idea was to enter through the walls. In February 1863, Grant tried to turn the Mississippi Delta itself into a road. Engineers cut through the levee near Moon Lake, allowing river water to pour into Yazoo Pass. The idea was bold. A flotilla could leave the Mississippi far above Vicksburg, enter the Coldwater and Tallahatchie rivers, then approach the Yazoo from behind the batteries at Snyder's Bluff. On a map, it looked like a hidden corridor. On the water, it became a 200-mile tunnel of trees. Ironclads, gunboats, and transports squeezed through narrow channels where branches scraped smokestacks and the current pushed hulls into the banks. Progress was slow enough for Confederate officers to understand where the expedition was going. Near Greenwood, where the Tallahatchie and Yallabusha rivers joined to form the Yazoo, a fortified position called Fort Pemberton blocked the route. The position was crude but effective. Earthworks and heavy guns covered a narrow waterway where Union vessels could not maneuver freely. On March 11, Federal ironclads opened fire. Their shells struck the fort, but they could not silence it. The surrounding ground was too wet for infantry to approach in force. Every extra day gave General William Loring's defenders more time to strengthen the barrier. For 3 weeks, Union gunboats and soldiers tried to break through. They failed. On April 5, the expedition turned back through the same winding passage it had taken weeks to enter. Vicksburg remained untouched. 3 days after the first shots at Fort Pemberton, Admiral David Dixon Porter tried another route. On March 14, he led 5 gunboats into Steele's Bayou, supported by troops from William Tecumseh Sherman's XV Corps. The channels twisted through cypress swamps toward waterways that could return the fleet to the Yazoo above Snyder's Bluff. If the vessels broke through, Porter might place his guns behind the Confederate defenses without passing Vicksburg at all. But these ironclads had been built to fight forts and enemy ships. Here, the battlefield was scarcely wider than their hulls. Trees leaned across the water. Wheels and rudders caught in vegetation. Boats sometimes had to move almost one behind another, with little room to turn and no space to form a firing line. Confederate patrols did not need to sink them with cannon. They only needed to stop the waterway from being a waterway. Axes began striking trees ahead of the flotilla. Trunks crashed into the channel. Then Confederate troops moved behind Porter and began dropping trees across the route he had already traveled. The gunboats were being sealed inside the swamp. If the last channel closed, 5 armored vessels could be trapped where their guns were almost useless, their crews exposed to rifle fire, and their engines unable to force the boats through solid timber. Porter abandoned the advance. The vessels began backing through the narrow route, fighting for yards of open water between branches, mud, and fallen trunks. The machines that had battered Confederate forts were retreating from men with axes. By late March, another path to Vicksburg had disappeared. In Union camps, the cost was becoming visible. Men stood in water, slept in damp clothing, and watched sickness spread. Northern newspapers described the expeditions as evidence that Grant had no workable plan. Some demanded his removal. Pemberton could read those newspapers too. From Confederate headquarters, the pattern seemed reassuring. Grant opened a canal. It failed. He entered a pass. Fort Pemberton stopped him. He pushed gunboats into a bayou. Trees turned them around. Each threat took days or weeks to develop. Most collapsed before Pemberton had to risk the main defenses of Vicksburg. This was the hidden consequence of the bayou experiments. They failed to reach the city. But every failure trained Confederate headquarters to expect the next Union movement to fail slowly. Pemberton did not become careless because Grant vanished. He became less urgent because Grant kept appearing in the wrong places. The expeditions had found no road to Vicksburg, but they had begun building camouflage for the road that finally worked. On the 31st of March, 1863, the first columns of John McClernand's the 13 Corps left Milliken's Bend and began marching south along the Louisiana side of the Mississippi. There was no proper military road waiting for them. The river had flooded the low country. Wheels sank into mud. Men laid timber across impassable stretches, building corduroy roads one log at a time. They bridged pools, dragged wagons around washed-out ground, and followed roundaway bayou because the direct route existed mostly on maps. McClernand's advance reached New Carthage on April 6. Behind him came 4 divisions, then James McPherson's the 17th Corps. Sherman remained north of Vicksburg, guarding the base and preserving the possibility of another attack from the Yazoo. But infantry on the west bank could not invade Mississippi alone. Grant needed gunboats to protect a crossing and transports to carry thousands of men across. Both were still above Vicksburg. On the night of April 16, David Dixon Porter tried to bring them through. At about 9:15, 7 ironclads, 1 ram, 3 transports, a tug, and 18 barges left the mouth of the Yazoo. Coal and supplies filled the barges lashed against the vessels. A 19th carried ammunition, but no captain wanted it beside his ship under Confederate fire. It was released to drift downstream alone. At 11:10, Porter's flagship, the Benton, rounded the bend above Vicksburg. Confederate sentinels fired muskets. Bonfires erupted along the shore. Within minutes, the river was bright enough for gunners on the bluffs to see the dark hulls below. Then the batteries opened. For 2 miles, cannon flashed through smoke while shells crossed the river in both directions. Pilots lost their bearings. Eddies turned vessels sideways. Boats collided as the formation broke apart. One transport lost power when a shell cut its steam line and had to be taken in tow. Another was disabled, set ablaze, abandoned, and burned almost to the waterline. If the fleet stopped beneath the batteries, Grant's crossing plan would die before 1 infantry regiment reached Mississippi. But the current kept carrying the surviving vessels south. At 2 in the morning, the guns fell silent. Porter had lost 1 transport and a coal barge. 12 men were wounded, but no one had been killed. 6 days later, unarmed transports repeated the passage. Confederate gunners sank 1 transport and 6 barges, yet enough vessels survived. Grant now possessed a moving bridge below Vicksburg. Few Confederate officers understood how completely the situation had changed. Porter could no longer easily return north against the current and batteries, but he did not need to. His vessels could meet Grant's army below the city. And while that army continued south, other Union forces began drawing marks across Pemberton's map. On April 2, Frederick Steele's division landed at Greenville and spent nearly 3 weeks raiding the Yazoo Delta. On April 17, Colonel Benjamin Grierson rode from LaGrange, Tennessee, with 1,700 cavalrymen. His raiders cut telegraph wires, tore up railroad tracks, seized livestock, and drove through eastern Mississippi toward Baton Rouge. Pemberton sent cavalry and infantry after them. Then reports arrived that McClernand was moving south in force on the far side of the Mississippi. Now picture the map from John Pemberton's headquarters. There was no single Union arrow. There were arrows everywhere. Steele threatened from the north. Grierson cut communications in the east. Porter's fleet was below Vicksburg. McClernand moved beyond the western bank. Sherman still held troops near the Yazoo and could turn a demonstration into an attack if Vicksburg was stripped of defenders. Each report was credible. Each demanded attention. Each made the others harder to interpret. Pemberton warned Richmond that the enemy was constantly in motion in all directions. But when told McClernand was marching south with a large force, he answered with 3 fatal words. Much doubted. By sending his cavalry after Grierson, he had surrendered his best means of discovering whether that report was true. Pemberton was not blind because he saw nothing. He was blind because every direction contained evidence. Grant had not yet chosen the exact place where he would cross, but the Confederate system was already losing the ability to recognize it when he did. On April 29, Sherman added one more threat. While Grant and Porter prepared to strike Grand Gulf, Sherman moved gunboats and transports towards Snyder's Bluff, north of Vicksburg. The demonstration was deliberately visible, and it returned to the same sector where Sherman had attacked in December. Pemberton could not strip Vicksburg without gambling that this apparent northern assault would remain only a demonstration. Sherman's movement did not create the confusion by itself. It kept one more believable danger alive at the exact moment Grant needed Confederate attention divided. At 7:30 on the morning of the 29th of April, 1863, 7 Union ironclads pulled away from Hard Times Landing and moved toward Grand Gulf. Behind them came 6 transports carrying approximately 10,000 men from John McClernand's 13th Corps. The crossing point looked logical. Grand Gulf stood below Vicksburg on the eastern bank of the Mississippi, close enough to give Grant a road into the interior. But Brigadier General John Bowen had built 2 fortified positions into the heights above the river. Fort Wade occupied the lower ground. Fort Coburn stood higher, where its guns could fire down into vessels that could not elevate their own cannon far enough to answer effectively. Grant's plan required the Navy to silence both positions. Only then could the unarmored transports approach the shore. At 8 o'clock, David Dixon Porter opened fire. The ironclads moved downstream past the batteries, firing as they went, then turned their bows into the current to hold position. Smoke settled over the water. Shells tore splinters from casemates and hammered iron plating. The gunboats closed to within roughly 100 yards of the lower defenses. Fort Wade began to fall silent. Fort Coburn did not. Its guns remained above the effective reach of several Union vessels. From that elevation, Confederate crews continued firing into decks, pilot houses, smokestacks, and exposed gun ports. One projectile punched into a ship, another severed equipment or shattered timber inside armor designed to keep men alive. Porter's flagship and the other ironclads answered round after round. Over 5 hours, the fleet fired approximately 2,500 shells. The Confederates replied with fewer guns, but better angles. They struck the ironclads more than 200 times. One vessel, the Tuscumbia, was knocked out of action. Armor plates loosened. Steam filled compartments. Men carried the wounded below decks, while gun crews continued loading in heat, smoke, and metal fragments. 18 Union sailors were killed and 57 wounded. Porter himself was among the wounded. The Confederate defenders suffered 3 killed and 19 wounded, and beyond the gunboats, the transports waited. Thousands of soldiers stood or sat inside wooden vessels with no armor, listening to the bombardment and watching smoke cover the eastern shore. They had marched through Louisiana mud to reach this point. Now, they could do nothing while the Navy tried to open the door. If the transports approached before the Confederate guns were silenced, one disabled vessel could block the landing while shells ripped through decks crowded with infantry. Grant would not spend 10,000 men to prove his plan was still correct. At about 1 o'clock, Porter broke off the attack. The gunboats withdrew toward Hard Times. The transports turned away with the soldiers still aboard. Grand Gulf had held. From the Confederate side, the result looked like a victory. Bowen had stopped the fleet. Grant had failed to cross. Telegraph messages carried the news toward Pemberton's headquarters. At last, the Union threat seemed to have revealed its real shape and been defeated. But Grant did not pause long enough for that conclusion to become useful. He ordered the soldiers off the transports and sent them marching south along the Louisiana levee. That evening, he learned of a plantation landing at Bruinsburg, roughly 10 miles below Grand Gulf, with a road climbing toward the bluffs. After dark, Porter's damaged ironclads and the transports ran past the Grand Gulf batteries. Bowen's guns fired again, but the vessels passed without further loss and continued downstream to meet the army. The Confederates had won the battlefield Grant no longer needed. Grand Gulf was a tactical failure. It had cost lives, damaged ships, and destroyed the original crossing plan. But it also held Confederate attention on the batteries, the smoke, and the landing that had just been abandoned. The attack had failed as an assault. As camouflage for the crossing that followed, it was almost perfect. Before sunrise on April 30, the first Union transports nosed into the plantation landing at Bruinsburg. Men of the 24th and 46th Indiana stepped down the gangplanks first. Their boots touched Mississippi soil. They expected rifle fire from the trees or cannon from the bluffs. Nothing came. A band aboard the USS Benton began playing the Red, White, and Blue, while more boats crowded toward shore. It sounded triumphant, but the operation was still at its most fragile point. The landing lay on the floodplain. Between the river and the eastern bluffs stretched roughly 1 mile of low ground. Grant's soldiers had water behind them, high ground ahead of them, and no fortified position in either direction. The transport still had to unload artillery, ammunition, horses, and thousands of additional troops. If Confederate infantry reached those bluffs first, the Union landing area could become a killing ground. John McClernand did not wait for the whole army to assemble. His advance units pushed inland as soon as they came ashore. Regiments climbed away from the floodplain and occupied the heights while the river behind them filled with steam whistles, shouted orders, rolling wheels, and animals fighting the ramps. This was the first movement. The vulnerable middle came next. By late morning, the shore was clogged with men and equipment. Gun crews struggled to bring their pieces up from the boats. Units arrived out of sequence and searched for their brigades. Horses slipped on planks. Wagons waited for space. Each transport had to unload, pull away, and make room for another. Grant possessed no secure bridge back across the Mississippi. Porter's vessels had run below Vicksburg and could not casually return against the current and the guns. Most of the army's wagons, draft animals, and provisions had been left behind to increase the speed of the landing. For the moment, Grant had traded logistical safety for mass, but the Confederates still did not appear. By late afternoon, approximately 17,000 soldiers of McClernand's the 13th Corps and portions of McPherson's the 17th Corps were ashore. Union troops held the bluffs. The landing area was no longer exposed to a sudden attack from above. The first door had closed. Grant later described the relief of finally standing on dry ground on the same side of the river as his enemy. Yet the achievement created a new danger. Vicksburg and the Mississippi now stood between his army and its established base. A successful landing could still become a larger trap if Grant remained close to the shore. He needed distance. The soldiers moved away from Bruinsburg and paused beneath the trees at Windsor Plantation. They had marched through Louisiana mud, waited inside crowded transports, and climbed the bluffs under the expectation of enemy fire. Now they sat in the shade, eating hard crackers, while officers studied the roads ahead. Grant could not give them the night. The bridges over Bayou Pierre lay between the army and Port Gibson. If Confederate troops destroyed those crossings, Grant's advance could be delayed long enough for Pemberton to concentrate against the bridgehead. At 5:30 that evening, the columns rose again. Instead of taking the direct Bruinsburg road, they swung onto the Rodney Road, past Bethel Church, and pressed inland through a clear, moonlit night. The country seemed to stand on edge. Narrow ridges offered room for marching and fighting, but steep ravines beside them were packed with timber, cane, and vines. The men marched four abreast. Accoutrements clinked in the darkness. Artillery wheels and wagons rumbled behind them. Some soldiers became so exhausted that they reportedly dozed while still walking. They knew Confederate troops were close. They did not know where. John Bowen, commanding at Grand Gulf, had the only Confederate force near enough to interfere. But he had not known where Grant would land. He divided his brigades between the roads leading toward Port Gibson, trying to cover multiple approaches with too few men. Pemberton had finally begun calling troops back from the pursuit of Grierson and sending brigades south from Vicksburg. The orders were moving. Grant was moving faster. Shortly after midnight, McClernand's advance encountered Brigadier General Martin Greene's Confederate brigade a few miles from Port Gibson. The Phantom campaign was over. The armies had found each other, but by then, the crucial reversal had already occurred. Pemberton had protected Grand Gulf from the landing he expected. Grant had crossed at a landing even Grant had not expected until the previous evening. The river had no bridge. By sunset, Grant had built one from gunboats, transports, exhausted soldiers, and Confederate hesitation. The first Confederate shots came shortly after midnight on May 1. Near Port Gibson, John Bowen's brigades tried to stop Grant before the bridgehead became a campaign. Narrow ridges twisted between wooded ravines, and roads disappeared behind hills. But Bowen had too few men to cover every approach. Throughout the day, Confederate brigades shifted between threatened positions while McClernand fed fresh Union regiments into the fight. By evening, Bowen withdrew toward Grand Gulf. The batteries that had defeated Porter 2 days earlier were abandoned because Grant's infantry was approaching from the landward side. The river fortress had been turned without being captured from the river. Grant could have stopped there. Grand Gulf offered a base and fleet connection. Grant moved inland instead. Pemberton still had an army. Joseph E. Johnston could bring reinforcements into Mississippi. If those forces united, Grant might be trapped with 2 rivers behind him. So he attacked the system around Vicksburg. Grant drove northeast toward the railroad connecting Vicksburg with Jackson. At Raymond on May 12, Union troops defeated a Confederate force. On May 14, Grant entered Jackson, damaged railroad facilities, and forced Johnston away from the state capital. Then he turned west. Pemberton could finally see the campaign hidden beneath the fleets, raids, and failed waterways. Vicksburg was not being approached along one predictable line. It was being cut away from the army, railroad, and command structure that might save it. On May 16, the armies collided at Champion Hill. The battle broke Pemberton's position. The next morning, Union troops surged into the works at Big Black River Bridge. The defense collapsed. Roughly 1,800 Confederate soldiers were captured, and the survivors fled toward Vicksburg as the bridges burned behind them. The road out of the fortress was closing. Grant reached Vicksburg on May 18. Direct assaults on May 19 and May 22 failed with heavy losses. Grant stopped trying to force the door. He surrounded it. For 47 days, artillery struck the defenses while food, health, and hope diminished inside the city. On the 4th of July, 1863, Pemberton surrendered Vicksburg. 5 days later, Port Hudson fell. The Mississippi was open, and the Confederacy had been divided. But the decisive moment came before the siege trenches and white flags. It came at a plantation landing, where no Confederate regiment was waiting. Yazoo Pass had failed. Steele's Bayou had failed. Grand Gulf had failed. Yet every failure increased Confederate uncertainty until Grant moved faster than Pemberton could correct his assumptions. The riverbank at Bruinsburg is quiet now. There are no crowded transports, horses fighting the ramps, or music drifting from an ironclad. But that was where 17,000 visible men passed through an invisible gap in the Confederate system. Grant did not hide the army. He hid the moment when the army became the real attack. Subscribe for more hidden turning points where failed plans, overlooked roads, and enemy assumptions changed the fate of a war.